The wheelchair sat on the auction block like a throne made of mockery, and Lynn knew it was meant for her before the first bid was even called. It was crudely made, of pine and iron, but the man slumped in it was what held the town's collective breath. His name was Thomas Vance, and 6 months ago, a falling beam in his own barn had turned him from a homesteader into a piece of property. His shoulders were broad, but they sagged with a helplessness that was almost as profound as the silence from the crowd. This was Redemption Creek, Wyoming, in the blistering summer of 1878. The town was owned, in all but name, by a man named Silas Croft. He stood near the auctioneer, a thick man with a smile that never reached his eyes. He had bought up Thomas's debt, his land, his future. Now, he was disposing of the man himself. "What am I bid for this unfortunate burden?" the auctioneer bellowed, his voice dripping with false pity. A few cruel chuckles rippled through the crowd of dusty ranchers and townsfolk. Lynn stood at the back, her hands clenched inside the sleeves of her worn grey dress. At 25, she was already a widow, her husband taken by a fever that swept through the railroad camp 2 years prior. As a Chinese woman alone, she was an object of suspicion and scorn, a ghost in a town that barely tolerated her existence. She ran a small laundry service from a shack at the edge of town, scrubbing the grit from the clothes of the very people who now stared at her. Croft's eyes found hers across the dusty square. The smile on his face widened. "It seems we have a volunteer," he declared, his voice booming. "The good widow, Lynn. A woman with no family, no prospects. And here, a man with no future. It seems a fitting match. A charity case for a charity case." He was not auctioning Thomas. He was giving him away. It was a joke, a piece of public theater designed to humiliate them both. The crowd laughed openly now, a harsh, grating sound. They were laughing at the useless cripple and the foreign woman. Lynn felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a burn of shame and fury. She could turn and walk away. She could flee back to her shack and bolt the door. But then she looked at Thomas Vance. He had not looked up, his gaze fixed on his own hands, which lay still and pale in his lap. But she saw the muscle in his jaw clench, a single, defiant knot of pride in a sea of degradation. Something in her, something she thought had died with her husband, stirred. It was not pity. It was a cold, hard anger. Croft wanted to make them into a spectacle of weakness. He wanted to break them in front of everyone. Lynn took a steadying breath, the dust thick in her throat. She pushed through the crowd, the laughter quieting to murmurs as she approached the platform. She stopped not in front of Croft, but in front of the wheelchair. For the first time, Thomas Vance lifted his head. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, and in their depths, she saw not despair, but a banked fire of pure, unadulterated rage. He was not broken. He was caged. "I will take him," Lynn said, her voice quiet but clear. It carried across the stunned silence. Croft's smile faltered for a second. This was not the reaction he'd expected. He'd wanted tears, or pleas. "Very generous of you," he said, recovering. "Of course, you'll also be taking on his property." A fine piece of dust, a broken-down barn, and not a drop of water to be found. "The deed is all but worthless." He held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of surrender. Lynn met his gaze. "I will take it all," she said. The journey to the Vance homestead was a grim, silent affair. Lynn had paid a freighter a few precious coins to haul the wheelchair in the back of his wagon. She walked alongside, leading the tired mule that was her only other possession of value. The sun beat down, turning the parched landscape into a shimmering haze. Thomas said nothing, his face a stony mask. He had not thanked her. He had not even looked at her since she'd claimed him. She felt a prickle of doubt. Perhaps the town was right. Perhaps she had just shackled herself to a ruin. The farm was worse than Croft had described. The small cabin sagged, its clapboard siding bleached and splintered. The field was a patchwork of cracked earth and withered stalks of corn. The barn, where his life had changed forever, leaned at a precarious angle, a monument to his failure. It was a place where hope had come to die. Lynn helped the freighter get the wheelchair down, the iron wheel sinking into the soft dirt. She gave the man his money, and he left without a word, eager to escape the oppressive misery of the place. Now they were alone. The silence was broken only by the buzz of flies and the whisper of hot wind through the dead corn. "Why?" Thomas's voice was a low rasp, rusty from disuse. Lynn turned. He was looking at the cabin, at the dead fields, at the whole sorry picture. "Why did you do it?" "Because I do not like Mr. Croft's jokes," she answered simply. A humorless smile touched his lips. "So for that, you've saddled yourself with me," and this he gestured with a slight tilt of his head to the desolation around them. "This isn't charity. It's foolishness." "Perhaps," Lynn said, untying the small bundle from her mule's back. It contained all she owned, a change of clothes, a small pot, a bag of rice, and the tin box where she kept her husband's savings. "But it is my foolishness. Not yours." She set about making the cabin habitable, sweeping out layers of dust and chasing out a pack rat. Thomas watched from the doorway, his silence a heavy, judgmental presence. Every movement she made, every bucket of water she hauled from the nearly dry well, felt like a performance for an unimpressed audience. The work was hard, but it was familiar. What was unfamiliar was the weight of another person's life resting so squarely on her shoulders. 3 days later, the real trouble arrived. 2 men on horseback rode into the yard, their horses kicking up clouds of yellow dust. They were Croft's men, rough-faced and confident. The taller one, a man with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the cabin step. "Croft sent us," he announced, not bothering to dismount. "He says you're trespassing." This land was forfeit for the debt. Lynn stepped out of the cabin, placing herself between the men and the doorway where Thomas sat in his chair. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face impassive. "The deed was given to me. In the town square. In front of witnesses." The man laughed. "That was sport. The real deed is with Croft. Now, you and the cripple have until sundown to clear out, or we'll clear you out." Lynn's hands trembled, but she did not move. She had nothing. No weapon, no allies. Behind her, she heard the creak of wood and iron. "Jedediah," Thomas's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "You tell Silas Croft that the Homestead Act of 1862, Section 4, is very specific about the forfeiture of a claim due to incapacitation. It requires a judgment from a territorial marshal, not a pronouncement from a land-grabbing bully." The man, Jedediah, stared. He had clearly not expected the man in the chair to speak, let alone with such authority. "What are you talking about, Vance?" "I'm talking about the law," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength. "Something your boss likes to ignore. Furthermore, my deed has a riparian clause tied to the old survey of '68. My water rights predate his downstream dam. He knows it. You know it. And if you set 1 foot on this property without a warrant signed by a federal judge, I'll have the U.S. Marshal from Cheyenne down on you so fast your head will spin." Jedediah and his partner exchanged a nervous glance. They were thugs, not lawyers. They understood threats of violence, not citations of federal law. They had come expecting to intimidate a frightened woman and a helpless man. They found something else entirely. "This ain't over, Vance," Jedediah snarled, but the threat was hollow. He wheeled his horse around, and the 2 men galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and uncertainty. Lynn turned, her legs feeling weak with relief. She looked at Thomas, truly looked at him, for the first time. The slumped shoulders were gone. He sat straighter in his chair, the fire she had seen in the town square now burning brightly in his eyes. He was not just a body in a chair. He was a mind, sharp and formidable. She did not yet know that the water rights he spoke of were tied to a secret Croft would kill to protect. That night, a fragile truce settled between them. Lynn cooked a thin stew of rice and dried vegetables over the hearth. Thomas, for his part, spoke. He told her about the farm, about how he had chosen this plot not for its soil, but for what lay beneath it. My father was a surveyor, he explained, his gaze distant. He taught me how to read the land. The dip in that ridge, the type of scrub that grows on the north face, it all points to water. A spring, deep underground. Croft's men said the land was dry, Lynn said, stirring the pot. Croft wants it to be dry, Thomas corrected her. He built a dam downstream a few years back, choking off the creek that used to run through here. He's been buying up all the homesteads on this side of the valley for pennies on the dollar, claiming they're worthless. But he knows about the spring. He has to. He paused, and the silence stretched. The day of my accident. I wasn't just repairing the barn. I was rigging a winch. A drill. I was a day away from breaking through to the aquifer. Lynn stopped stirring. Your accident. Thomas's face darkened. The main support beam. It had been sawed through. Not all the way. Just enough to weaken it. Enough for it to give way when I put my weight on it. I didn't see it until it was too late. The implication hung in the air, heavy and cold as a winter stone. Croft hadn't just taken advantage of his misfortune. He had orchestrated it. The cruelty of the auction, the public humiliation, it was all a smokescreen to cover a crime. To get the land and the man who knew its secret out of the way for good. Lynn looked at the deed Croft had so mockingly given her. She had thought it worthless. Now, she held it in her hands, the paper worn and soft. It felt heavy, freighted with a truth that could get them both killed. In the dim firelight, she saw the clause he had mentioned, a few lines of spidery script referencing a territorial water survey from a decade earlier. It was real. We have the deed, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We have the claim. A piece of paper is no match for Silas Croft, Thomas said bitterly. He owns the town, the sheriff, everything. He'll just send more men. Next time, they won't be scared off by legal talk. He was right. They were isolated, vulnerable. But Lynn's anger had now found a focus. It was no longer a diffuse rage at her own predicament, but a sharp, clear purpose. They had been wronged. This land, this water, it was Thomas's by right, by law, and by sweat. She went to the tin box where she kept her money. It wasn't much, the painstakingly saved wages from years of washing other people's dirt. She counted it out on the rough wooden table. $63. Enough to buy a train ticket to Cheyenne and back, with a little left over. Or enough to send a message. The telegraph, she said, looking at Thomas. You mentioned a U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. And a federal judge. Hope flickered in his eyes, quickly followed by doubt. A telegraph costs money. And there's no guarantee anyone will listen. To them, I'm a cripple and he trailed off, but she knew what he meant. I am a citizen, Lynn said, her voice firm. My husband worked for the railroad. He helped build the line that carries those messages. I will use it. It was a desperate gamble. Sending a telegraph was like shouting into the wind. It might be heard, or it might be lost forever. And spending the money meant they would have nothing left. If it failed, they would not even have the means to run. It was a choice that cost her the last vestiges of her own security. She was tying her fate completely to his. Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable. He saw the worn dress, the determined set of her jaw, the small pile of coins that represented her entire world. He saw a woman who had been offered nothing but scorn, who had every reason to save herself, choosing instead to stand with him. The marshal's name is Davies, he said softly. Tell him Thomas Vance invokes the Federal Homestead Protection Act. Tell him Silas Croft is stealing the water. The next morning, Lynn rode her mule into town. The journey felt different this time. The stares she received were still hostile, but now they were tinged with a grudging curiosity. She ignored them, her focus entirely on the small telegraph office at the end of the main street. She wrote out the message, her hand steady, and pushed her money across the counter. The operator, a thin man with a green eyeshade, read it and looked up at her, his eyebrows raised. He knew Croft. Everyone did. He tapped out the message, the clicks and silences echoing in the small room like a secret code. The waiting was the hardest part. Days turned into a week. Croft's men rode by the farm daily, their presence a silent threat. They did not trespass, but they watched. Every creak of the cabin floor, every gust of wind, sounded like an approaching rider. Lynn and Thomas worked. She cleared the field of the dead stalks, her hands blistering and raw. He, from his chair, used his surveyor's eye and keen mind to plan. He drew in the dirt with a stick, sketching out designs for an irrigation system, showing her how the channels should be dug to use the natural grade of the land. He taught her how to read the soil, how to brace the leaning wall of the barn. Slowly, a partnership formed, born of necessity and a shared, unspoken resolve. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, a lone rider appeared. He was not one of Croft's thugs. He was tall in the saddle, wearing the dusty coat of a lawman, a federal star pinned to his chest. Marshal Davies had come. He was a quiet, observant man who listened more than he spoke. He read the deed. He walked the property line with Lynn, listening as she repeated the story Thomas had told her. He examined the weakened beam in the barn. Then, he sat with Thomas on the porch for over an hour, the two men speaking in low tones. When Davies finally stood to leave, he looked at Silas Croft's large ranch house, visible on the far ridge. "A man can get awful thirsty trying to own a whole valley," he said. "And thirsty men make mistakes." The marshal's presence changed the equation. Croft could bully a widow and a paralyzed man, but he could not so easily dismiss a U.S. Marshal. An official land surveyor arrived from Cheyenne a week later. With Lynn's help, he and his team set up their equipment. Using Thomas's hand-drawn maps and his father's old notes, they found the spot. The drill, powered by 2 strong mules, bit into the hard-packed earth. For 2 days, it churned, digging deeper and deeper. On the 3rd day, with a great sucking sound, it broke through. A plume of muddy water shot into the air, then settled into a steady, gushing flow. It was sweet and cold. It was life. 3 months later, the Vance homestead was unrecognizable. The fields, once cracked and barren, were now lush with rows of thriving vegetables, irrigated by a network of small channels Thomas had designed. The cabin was repaired, the barn secured. Lynn had hired 2 men from a neighboring county, men with no loyalty to Croft, to help with the heavy labor. She worked alongside them, her body lean and strong from the endless work. Thomas was the mind of the operation. From his chair on the porch, he directed the work, kept the account books, and negotiated with the freight company to haul their produce to the railroad depot. Word of the miracle farm had spread. Homesteaders who had been starved for water by Croft's dam began to come to them, not for charity, but for business. They bought water, they bought produce, they bought hope. Silas Croft was ruined. The federal investigation spurred by Marshal Davies had uncovered a decade of fraudulent claims, intimidation, and theft. Faced with federal charges, he sold his holdings and disappeared, a disgraced man. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Lynn sat on the porch steps, cleaning dirt from under her fingernails. Thomas wheeled his chair beside her. He held out a piece of paper. It was a new deed, issued by the Territorial Land Office, with both of their names on it. Lynn Vance. Thomas Vance. A partnership, he said, his voice quiet. Lynn looked from the paper to the green fields, then to the man beside her. The town had meant for him to be her burden. They had meant for them to be a joke, a symbol of failure. But together, they had built this. His mind and her will. His knowledge and her strength. He was not the pride of the plains because he had miraculously learned to walk again. He was the pride of the plains because he had shown everyone what a man could build from a broken body and an unbroken mind. And she, the woman they had dismissed as a foreign ghost, was the farmer who had made the desert bloom. A partnership, she agreed, and for the first time, she reached out and put her hand over his. His fingers, calloused from gripping the wheels of his chair, closed around hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of a deeper, more profound connection. It was the feeling of home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.